Well, good morning, everyone, both on site and online. It's good to see everyone. Jerry Canfield is still not able to be here this morning. Lord willing, he'll be back next Sunday, and we'll continue or complete his study of Revelation. Chris is not here today. He's not sick, as was planned, but he's not here today, so you're stuck with me again this morning. There's some remarkably interesting and highly symbolic and even certainly prophetic events over the last days of Jesus' life. Many didn't understand what was going to happen. Jesus did. He used his last days, in my opinion, as a teaching tool. All the Gospels basically record the events of the last days of his life. I prefer Mark's version. And then we'll note some nuances between the other gospel writers' versions. But fulfilled prophecy is front and center of the last days of Jesus' life. Prophecies such as Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. He was on a donkey or a colt. Mark 11, verse 1. Jesus sends two of his disciples. We don't know which two. To a village ahead of you. We don't know what village. It's uncertain, but it's probably Bethpage. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethpage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here shortly.'" Bethpage was located on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Let me, if I can bring this map up here. So, you see the little red dot there. That's basically the Mount of Olives. And between Bethany and the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem is the Kidron Valley. And right really close to Bethany, between Bethany and the Mount of Olives, is Bethpage. It's close to Bethany, and they're linked in this conjunction, Bethpage and Bethany. So it's nearby Jerusalem. It's nearby Bethany. It's also on the way. We'll get into this in just a minute. It's on the way between Bethany and Jerusalem. Matthew, in his recording of this in Matthew chapter 21, only refers to Bethpage. So it was likely the unnamed village which Jesus sent his two disciples to get this donkey's colt. The two disciples may very well have been Peter and John. They're the ones that Jesus instructed later to go make preparations for the Passover observance. But the two are never really named. But this is fulfillment of prophecy from Zechariah 9, verse 9. "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on the colt, on the foal of a donkey." The prophecy of Jesus entering into Jerusalem that Mark refers to in verses 9 through 11 of chapter 11. "Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, 'Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest.'" What's interesting and ironic is three or 4 days later, many of those same people would be yelling, "Crucify him." But now they're yelling, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Psalm 118, verses 26 and 27 is probably the prophecy that points to this. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we bless you. The Lord is God. He has made his light shine upon us. With bows in hand, join the festal procession up to the horns of the altar." In 2 Kings chapter 9, Elisha sends a messenger to give the word of the Lord to Jehu. And after pouring oil over Jehu, the messenger says to him in verse 12, "I have anointed you king over Israel." And after that declaration, everyone who was present, they took their garments and they placed them under his steps. And they blew the trumpet, shouting, "Jehu is king." So what does that mean with Jesus' triumphant entry in Jerusalem? Well, it would imply that the multitude recognized Jesus as a king. In the case of Jehu, they laid their garments and palm branches. That kind of was an improvised red carpet for the king. And Jesus continues into Jerusalem, and the multitudes are yelling at him, "Hosanna, the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Well, they're recognizing Jesus as a king, and he's probably fulfilling the prophecy from Psalm 118, which was written most likely by David, King David, who writes these prophetic words about the coming of the Messiah, the one from the house of the Lord. So let's get into this. So Jesus is going to be basically headquartered in Bethany. That's kind of his home base. Mark chapter 11 refers to numerous times that Jesus is in Bethany. It's a small village. It's on the backside of the Mount of Olives. You know, the Mount of Olives was a ridge to the east of Jerusalem. I'm sure many of you have been there, visited there. Would love to do so myself one day. But the Mount of Olives, the road to Bethany, to Jerusalem, runs through the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley. So when you're looking from the Mount of Olives across the valley, you can see Jerusalem. It's kind of modern-day Jerusalem. So is there anything really special about the Mount of Olives? It's only mentioned a few times in the Old Testament. It's a place where David fled to and through when he was fleeing his son Absalom, after Absalom had briefly dethroned him, rebelled against him. We're told that Solomon built a pagan shrine on the Mount of Olives that King Josiah later demolished as part of his reforms and repentance for Israel. He tore them down. But I think the key to the Mount of Olives lies in Zechariah 14. Zechariah prophesies that God would transform Israel, and he would transform them into a truly holy society, and that all would come to worship God in Jerusalem. Zechariah tells us that God is bringing hope, and he's bringing hope to his people, and he's going to deliver his people through the Messiah. The Messiah will come and reign over a new kingdom, and a kingdom that will be in perfect harmony with him. And Zechariah tells us in chapter 14, verse 4, that the Mount of Olives is the place where the Lord will stand and begin his deliverance. That's a picture of an olive tree, and some of these trees are ancient that are on the Mount of Olives. Some of them are believed to be thousands of years old, may even have been there, or shoots from trees that were there when Jesus was living. But it's a place where God would begin his deliverance. Jesus' ascension into heaven is inferred to have been from the Mount of Olives. If you read Luke chapter 24, 50 and 51, Acts chapter 1, it's implied that his ascension was from the Mount of Olives, and it would be a fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah. What's interesting is the Jews to this day believe that the Mount of Olives is where the dead will be resurrected in the days of the coming of the Messiah. In fact, there's a huge Jewish cemetery there where an estimated 70, 75, maybe even 150,000 graves are located. Rabbis, many important public figures. I think even Prime Minister Menachem Begin is buried there because they want a ringside seat when the Messiah comes to resurrect and deliver his people. But what they don't realize is the Messiah has come, and he did come from the Mount of Olives, and he did deliver his people. It's also on the Mount of Olives where Jesus stands and weeps over Jerusalem in Luke chapter 19, where he's very sorrowful of what Jerusalem had become and what was going to become of Jerusalem. Also, at the foot of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where Jesus prayed before his arrest. And it's now within the city of Jerusalem. And there are 8 olive trees there, supposedly, that are over 3,000 years old. And they still bear fruit. And if they're not actual trees during that area or during that time, they very well could be shoots from those trees that were there when Jesus was praying. But there's great symbolism and there's great prophecy fulfilled in the Mount of Olives. And the Garden of Gethsemane, it's located there. And in Bethany, which we'll get into here in just a minute. So, Jesus is using Bethany as his home base here in his last few days. So basically he would start his day, he was staying overnight in Bethany. He would travel across the Mount of Olives over to Jerusalem. And Bethany, why would he choose Bethany as his home base? Why not Jerusalem? Wouldn't that make sense? If you're going to go into the temple to teach, and we'll get into this later, that's when he drove out the money changers and all these things that are occurring in his last day. Wouldn't you think he'd be in Jerusalem? Why Bethany? Well, number one, we know Bethany is where Lazarus, his friend Lazarus, that he raised from the dead, and that's where his Lazarus' sisters Mary and Martha lived. You remember the story of Lazarus. Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus that his dear friend Lazarus was near death. He needed to come immediately, but he delayed. And subsequently, Lazarus died. When he arrived 4 days later, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. And Martha disapproved of him taking such a long time to come. And that's when he assured Martha that Lazarus would rise again. And she thought, well, yeah, I know he'll rise during the resurrection on Judgment Day, but that's not what Jesus meant. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those that believe in me, though they may be dead, yet they will be alive, and whosoever lives and believes in me will never die. So he uses this as a teaching moment to Martha, and in the presence of this crowd of Jewish mourners, he has the stone rolled away and tells Lazarus to come out, and he did. And he raised him from the dead. Now, Mark does not mention the family. He doesn't mention that Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but John did in his account. Luke even writes kind of an oddly placed story. Jesus is visiting Mary and Martha, and Mary chooses to sit at Jesus' feet and listen to his teaching. And Martha is worried about preparing this large dinner for her guests, and she's complaining to Jesus that Mary's not helping her. But Jesus, of course, very lovingly dismisses Martha's concerns. Mark, again, in Mark chapter 14, records an instance where Jesus is again in Bethany. And it's Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 9. But Jesus is in Bethany, and a woman anoints him with expensive perfume. And this woman is criticized for wasting money. John, in his version, says that the one who anointed Jesus with the costly perfume was Mary of Bethany, sister of Martha and Lazarus. And that she wiped his feet with her hair, which would be a very shocking and intimate act in that culture. Mark's version just says that he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar, poured the perfume on his head. Some present were indignant, saying indignantly to one another, "Why waste this perfume? The money that could have been sold for more than a year's wages, the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing here. The poor will always be with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." John, in his description, his rendition of this event, he in John, I believe it's John chapter 12. Yeah, John chapter 12. He's a little more explicit. He says this took place 6 days before the Passover. And he adds other details that are not in Mark's details of how the house was filled with the scent of the fragrance, and that Judas, he's also identified by Mark. Judas was there. But it's John who records that Judas was the one that was objecting to the waste. Judas served as the treasurer of the group and probably used to pilfer funds. Mark seems to confirm Judas' dishonesty later in Mark chapter 14. So John, in his recording of this event, says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus, among others, was reclining at the table with him. Mary took out a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet, wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It's worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It's intended she should save the perfume for the day of my burial. You'll always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." So John's a little more descriptive. He says who it is, and it's Mary, and she wiped his feet with her hair. Mark just says he was just anointed over the head. He's also, John's more descriptive, saying basically Judas was a thief. And Mark just says Judas was there, and he's the one that complained about the wastefulness of this perfume that Jesus rebukes him over. But, you know, a small discrepancy. It's kind of interesting why one would identify her by name, one wouldn't. Another small discrepancy is that Mark records that they're in the house of Simon the leper. John records that he's in Bethany, the home of Lazarus. Well, it's not really, it may not really be contradictory, because I think he's simply saying that Jesus is in Bethany. That's where Lazarus lived, and that's where Simon the leper's house was. So I think really what is being said is, for instance, there's a difference between I am in Larry Todd's house versus I am in Fort Smith, the home of Larry Todd. So I think the correlation between the two is basically he's in Bethany where Lazarus lived in the home of Simon the leper. If that makes sense. So from the village of Bethany where Lazarus was resurrected to the Mount of Olives with the prophecy of Zechariah, it's easy to understand the importance and symbolism of these two locations, especially in this point in Jesus' life. The fig tree. Why did Jesus choose to curse the fig tree for not having figs when they weren't in season? Mark records this in Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 11. I'm beginning in verse 12. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached out, he found nothing but leaves because it was not season for the figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. Later on the next day, in verses 20 and 21, in the morning they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." Now, Matthew records this in Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 22. Early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. Back to Jerusalem from Bethany. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. And then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." And immediately the tree withered. The disciples saw this and were amazed. "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" they asked. So there's a bit of a seemingly a discrepancy here on when it withered and how all this took place. In Matthew 21, we find that Jesus was hungry and he saw this fig tree along the side of the road. He came close to it and there was no figs on it, and he cursed it and it withered. And it may appear that Jesus is responding in anger to the tree, like he's throwing some type of tantrum because the tree is not yielding fruit. But Mark says figs are not in season. But that's not the case at all. You have to keep in mind the broader backdrop of Jesus' teaching, his methodology he uses in teaching. He often used parables and word pictures and symbolism to teach. Most agree that Jesus is teaching a living parable here. And he's trying to teach his disciples an important truth. This cursing of the fig tree was a very dramatic visual aid, if you will. So what does this mean? What does this illustrate? Well, there's a lot of disagreement as to what he's trying to, the message he's trying to send here. Some say he was illustrating the principle that if they just simply had faith, they could do things like withering fig trees and moving mountains, as is recorded in Matthew chapter 18. They'd need this faith in the days to come. Others believe that the tree had leaves on it, and from a distance it appeared to be fruitful. But upon closer examination, it was clear there was no fruit on it at all. So perhaps Jesus' cursing of the fig tree is an acted out parable trying to teach the disciples that God will judge those who give an outer appearance of fruitfulness but in fact are not fruitful at all, just like the Pharisees. Some suggest that this fig tree is a representation of faithless Israel. Israel professed to be faithful to God and faithful as a nation. They, in fact, rejected Jesus, the Messiah, and Israel was ripe for judgment. And perhaps the withering of this fig tree foreshadows the withering or destruction of Jerusalem. When Titus and his Roman warriors would trample down and destroy Jerusalem in AD 70, that would end Israel as a political entity at that time. Some see this in conjunction with the fact of Jesus' cleansing of the temple, of the money changers. Jesus' initial response to the fig tree, and then the next morning, verses 20 and 21, that's sandwiched around Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple. And it's suggested that perhaps Jesus was teaching that at a distance the temple looked fine with all of its sacrificial activities, but on closer inspection it was found to be religion without substance. There was nothing there. It was full of hypocrisy. It was not bearing spiritual fruit. It was ripe for judgment. Others believe that the time of the year in which this incident occurred, probably Jesus was crucified late March, early April. Some really believe they have the exact date, April 6th, 30 AD. But the incident occurred in the last days of March, first days of April. And towards the end of March, the leaves begin to appear. It's no different than around here. Towards the end of March, the leaves begin to appear. And in about a week or so, the foliage kind of comes out and it's more complete. And these particular type of fig trees, they're a little pre-fruit knobs appear. They're not real figs. They're kind of an early forerunner. And when they kind of have their own indefinite maturity, but they're kind of like green almonds, and the peasants would eat them, and others when they were hungry. Maybe their appearance was a harbinger of the fully formed appearance of the king that would come. But Mark says the time for figs had not yet come. So if the leaves appear without fruit, and Jesus finds nothing but leaves, then he knew that this was an absolute hopeless situation for this tree, and it's fruitless, and he curses it. He knows in advance that his disciples would be astonished at this quick withering of the tree, the effect that his curse had, and he's trying to provoke a reaction to make this a lesson about faith and make it memorable. My opinion is it's simply the idea that God judges those who appear to be fruitful on the outside but are not really fruitful. He expects fruit. Now Matthew says the fig tree withered immediately. Mark says that the withered tree was not seen until the next day. So how do you reconcile that? Well, a possible reconciliation is on the morning of that entry into Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples are headed to Jerusalem, and they see this fig tree. It's some distance from the road. Jesus goes, and he doesn't find any figs. The disciples continue on down the road while he's out checking out this fig tree, and the disciples hear him, as he curses this fig tree. The fig tree withers, but the disciples have passed by. They're headed on their way to Jerusalem. And they didn't notice it had withered. Jesus and his disciples returned to Bethany that evening, and it may be too dark to see the tree. And the next morning they return to Jerusalem along the same road, and as they near the fig tree, Peter points out, and he and the disciples see this fig tree that has withered. And it's already withered, and they're amazed at it. In fact, why would Peter be amazed? He's seen Jesus do so many things in his ministry. Why would he be amazed that Jesus could actually curse and wither a fig tree immediately? But apparently he was. The tense and the words that are used seem to indicate surprise on the part of Peter. So the reconciliation of these two events most likely or reasonably can be assumed that Jesus went to check out the tree, and they were kind of, how you can be walking with a group and someone kind of goes over and checks something out, and he sees there's no fruit on there. He curses the tree that was not even in season, and they hear him, and they head on Jerusalem, come back. It's too dark on the return trip to Bethany, and then the next morning they see it. That seems plausible to me because Mark says the next morning is when they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. So that makes sense. But anyway, the symbolism of this fruitless fig tree, it's not about Jesus is just mad because this tree doesn't have fruit on it and he's hungry. There's symbolism in this fruit tree, this fig tree. God expects fruit, especially when someone or something appears to be fruitful on the outside. The clearing of the temple, in between Jesus cursing the fig tree and the next morning when they see that the tree is withered, in the middle of that is the Jesus clearing of the temple. Beginning in verse 15, on reaching Jerusalem, that's after they had left Bethany, crossed the Mount of Olives, they see this fig tree, Jesus curses it, then they head into Jerusalem. They go to the temple. Jesus enters the temple courts and begins driving out those who are buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And he taught them, saying, Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of robbers. Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7 is the scripture Jesus is quoting here. I will bring them to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations. Also, Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11, Jesus probably had in mind. Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? Yes, I too have seen it, declares the Lord. Verse 17 again, Jesus' words, not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. He's referring to the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah. He may even have in mind Malachi 3 verse 8. Would a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. In these various religious festivals, thousands of Jews would travel to Jerusalem. And the authorities had allowed these money changers and animal sellers into the outer court of the temple. People would buy their animals to sacrifice, and they had to exchange Roman money for money acceptable to the religious leaders. And so they'd show up for whatever festival, and to sacrifice, they may not have something. So, lo and behold, we'll help you out here. It's like last chance gas. You see the sign of a lonely road out in the desert, and there's a big sign that says last chance gas, next chance 300 miles or something like that. Or maybe somebody sets up a booth and they're selling ponchos at Niagara Falls. Or you're at a sporting event in the heat of August and they're selling bottled water for $10 a bottle. That's what's going on. Transactions at a fair price should have been made outside the temple courts. But these temple-sanctioned business people were selling inside a place of worship, and they were profiting financially off of it. They were cheating people. They were marking up their prices because of the convenience. And they had become dull and callous, and they were not reflecting God's Spirit. This problem was compounded because the leaders, the religious leaders were in on it. They were part of it. They may have even been receiving profits or kickbacks, and they may even have had some type of financial investment in these businesses. The money changers were making it hard for the common people to worship God. I mean, imagine that not only are they're inside the temple there, and they're selling these animals, but it's full of bleating lambs, and the sellers that are probably hawking, selling and saying, hey, I can imagine like the midway on the carnival, these hawkers out there. They're trying to get you to come in and sell you this and sell you that. And you have people showing up hoping they have enough money just to worship God. No one was focused on God. Everyone was focused on money or the lack of it. And Jesus was purifying the temple here because he was about to die, and he was about to rise from the dead and establish his own kingdom, his own temple, if you will, with his death and burial and resurrection. And the last thing is someone has to have money or in some way have the resources just to worship God. Jesus said that's not how this works. And that's why he is angry. And that's why he clears the temple. That's why he runs them out of the building. He said, you're turning this into a den of robbers. You're cheating the people. And that's not right. Well, we don't have time in this study this morning. There are other examples of symbolism and prophecy fulfilled. You have the story of the evil farmers. Jesus wasn't a tax protester, so to speak. When they tried to trap him into denouncing paying taxes, he said, well, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Another occasion, in Matthew chapter 17, it's time to pay the temple tax, and he tells Peter to go out and catch a fish, and in the fish's mouth was the coin that paid for him and Peter's tax. Mark records Jesus in his describing his resurrection and his future. And Mark describes the Last Supper and what goes on there and the fulfillment of not only of prophecy but also what will come, the foreshadowing of what will come. Jesus predicts Peter's denials, and there's a lot of symbolism, and there's a lot of teaching moments in that. And then you have Jesus in Gethsemane, that garden that's the bottom of the Mount of Olives. So all these things in the last days of Jesus' life that just seemed like some very interesting stories and parables and things like are even more than that. They're not only their symbolism, but many of them are prophecies that are being fulfilled. All these things are for a purpose. And Jesus' last days are for a purpose. It's to prepare for this new kingdom that will be coming. And that's why he does what he does, and that's why he says what he says, and that's why these prophecies are fulfilled. So at some point, maybe down the road, we'll get into more of Jesus' last days and some of these symbolic events and prophetic events that occur. But we'll stop there today. Thank you, and we'll be starting our worship in a mere 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you.